you to take the roll.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Chair. I will now take roll. Greg Heyman.
Present.
Sandy Rowe.
Here.
Emily Simnett.
Present.
Richard Devlin.
Present.
Rukaya Adams. And let me just check the attendees here to see I didn't miss anyone. Okay, that is roll.
Guthrie, I'm present. Sorry, I just
There we have.
Okay.
Hello, Commissioner Adams.
We have full attendance, Chair. Thank you. That is roll.
Thank you so much, Guthrie. This is my first time chairing this committee, and so the first thing I want to say is thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. And the next thing I want to say is when I screw it up, please just let me know. Don't. I'm fine with being corrected. So don't go, oh, I can't correct them in public. No, you certainly can. And I am not. Formality is not my strength. And I know that there are times when that is necessary, but it's not my nature, and which drove my own college crazy sometimes. But I do know that there's a place for that. And so I am going to attempt to refer to you as commissioners, and and hopefully that I can stick to that. I'll try. So I also wanted to give just some preliminary comments. It's important for me to be mindful of the role of the Funding and Achievement Subcommittee, and want to just remind us of all of us of that role. We are not a decision-making group. Our job is to more deeply enter into conversation about and evaluate issues that have to do with funding and institutional achievement. And we're doing that work on behalf of the Commission as a whole. So we don't actually do anything that is outside of the purview of the Commission as a whole, but we're sort of like, I don't know what you call us, a group that goes out ahead and hopefully digs more deeply, hopefully helps to ask the kinds of questions that I think we as commissioners should be asking when we face issues, again, in the areas of finance and institutional achievement. And if that doesn't result in clarification at our meeting, it prompts other staff especially to be prepared to address that question in our subsequent full HECC meeting. I think that's how it's worked historically, and Chair Rowe has given me a grand example of how to lead this meeting, so I will continue to try and do it in such manner. But I just wanted to make sure that we all sort of had an understanding of that and just sort of way in which we operate. I think we've been reminded on a number of occasions, while there are only, I think, 4 or 5 official members of the F&A, all commissioners are always welcome and invited and can participate fully in this process. They don't have to be a member of F&A for that to do that. It's just that those who have been identified as members, us, have a specific responsibility to be invested in this work. So I'm excited to get going. We have a lot of stuff ahead of us. So any questions before we go? Done. Okay. Then we will move on to a public comment. And Guthrie, do we have anybody who is signed up for or who is asking to provide public comment?
Thank you, Chair. We do not have any signups for public comment. Might I ask that we review and approve the November F&A meeting minutes? And while we're doing that, if any folks would like to sign up for public comment, you can drop your name in the chat. Thank you.
See, I'm already at being corrected, and I appreciate that. Yes, you should have a copy of the minutes from our prior meeting, which was in November. And you have any questions or corrections, we can address those now, and if not, we'd take a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Commissioner Devlin has moved.
Seconded.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Simnett. All in favor of approving the minutes from November? Aye, and some symbol, raise hand, something like that.
Aye.
Thanks so much. We have approved minutes. And again, Guthrie, thank you for reminding me of that. So now we are at the moment of public comment.
And again, Chair, it looks like we have no signups for today's public meeting.
Well, we have so jumped far ahead in the agenda so quickly, and appreciate that, I guess. So we're looking at public tuition setting, which is an overview and a primer. And I think Jim Pinkard is going to be making that presentation. I see him on the screen, so I suspect he's ready to go.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioners, good afternoon. A pleasure to be with you on this beautiful sunny afternoon in Salem. For the record, Jim Pinkard, I'm with the Office of Post-Secondary Finance and Capital, and I would also like to say it's my first time too, so go easy on me. Kind of like that Simpsons episode where Homer keeps telling his boss every time he messes up, it's my first day. No? Okay. Well, nonetheless, item 3.0 on your agenda is just an overview of the public university tuition setting process. And so this docket item is a bit lengthy, coming in at 10, 11 pages, lots of information in the appendices, and I'll touch on that just briefly. But do want to note that every year there are specific statutory requirements for each of the public universities in their tuition setting process. Those requirements are laid out in Appendix A. And we as HECC staff observe that process just to ensure we're maintaining an awareness of the process, that students are involved in the process, that there's information being exchanged, and we observe and sometimes participate in the meetings that occur on campus. Sometimes we visit the campus in person to participate in the tuition town hall conversations that occur. And so this docket item today just really lays out the current status where each of the 7 universities are in the process. And when you look at the process, big picture, kind of 3 stages. And so you have a tuition advisory body that makes a recommendation to the university president. You have the university president who then makes a recommendation to their board. And then you have the board who takes action to adopt the tuition and fees for the next academic year. This is all for academic year 24-25, which would start in the fall term later this fall. We do have some updates based on what was posted as part of your materials, because there were 2 board meetings just this past Friday. They're going to be, there's one coming up this Friday, and then another one next week and the week thereafter. So let me provide you with a verbal update by institution. So for Eastern Oregon University, their tuition advisory body is modeling under 5%, and their board is scheduled to consider a recommendation on April 30th, although we have yet to see an official formal recommendation to date. For Oregon Tech, their president's recommendation is 4.5%, and they're gonna, the board will consider that at their regularly scheduled meeting this Friday afternoon. For Oregon State University, their board last Friday adopted the president's recommendation at 4.7%. So they're under 5. Portland State University, their board adopted their president's recommendation last Friday at the regularly scheduled meeting. They came in at 4.8%. Southern Oregon University, their recommendation is 4.8%. And their board meeting is scheduled for April 19th. And so we'll be tuning in for that. University of Oregon, their board approved a 3% increase for new students with no change for continuing students. They, of course, have a guaranteed tuition program. So once you matriculate, enter the university, your tuition is guaranteed for all 4 years for your undergraduate experience. So they have a structured approach. The weighted average, of course, is under 5%. We calculate a weighted average because they use essentially an approach where different groups of students are charged a slightly different rate. So we use a weighted average approach to calculate that. More information on that weighted average approach can be found in Appendix B, where we talk a little bit more about how we calculate whether they're over or under the 5% threshold. The last update is Western Oregon University. Their recommendation is 5%, 5.0 precisely. And their board meeting is going to be on April 16th and 17th, at which they'll consider that. Just a brief note on some of the other appendices. Appendix C, Charlie C, has a 10-year review of historical changes in resident undergraduate tuition rates with the average annual increase, average annual growth rate. Appendix D has links to much more information for their current tuition rates, current fee structures. And then in the rest of the appendices, we give you more information about mandatory enrollment fees, remission rates, the different remission programs for the different institutions. And in Appendix F, we do talk about differential tuition for each one of the institutions that do charge a differential tuition rate.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, Commissioner Devlin.
I do want to note that I don't think it's my computer because I've tried it on 2 different devices. But for Appendix D, the one where you can go to get an overview and more detail, it appears that the only links that work are SOUs, Southern Oregon's, and the detailed, which for them it really isn't what it's supposed to be, but the detailed portion of OSU's. The others do not appear to be operational, the links that you have. Now, it could still be my computer or both of my computers, but when I try to go to those links, it takes me away to another site, but it all comes back as, no connection, wrong address, et cetera, et cetera. And so I just wanted to note that. I'm going to wait for some comments when we get to the how we compute what the 5% is, because I do have some questions there.
I appreciate that. I can tell you that we will revisit the links. They worked last Wednesday morning when we put them in the docket item, but I will say though that they can change over time, because I think some of the universities are in the middle of kind of updating since some of the boards made their decisions last week. I think they're updating those links. And so I wonder if they created a disconnect in doing that. But I will tell you for the May F&A as a bit of a preview, we will share with this group the detailed calculations that we have for each one of the 7 universities for the 24-25 academic year that shows you precisely the calculation, what fees we consider, tuition, all that good stuff. So we'll have more detailed information for the May F&A on the calculations themselves, if that helps.
Yeah. Well, if you'll recheck them, it could be an issue of what type of security programs I have on the computer too, because there are some that it.
Thank you. Commissioner Adams.
Thank you, Chair. Jim, it's always so nice to see you. Appendix C gave me a heart attack. Like literally, my heart palpitated when I saw these numbers. So I hope we can talk more. I don't want to jump into questions about it, but as someone who looks at numbers and volatility, this was jarring. And so I hope at some point during your presentation, we can dig into it a little bit, and it may be jarring because I don't understand them, but
Okay.
would love to talk more about them.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Commissioner Devlin, sorry.
since we're going to comment on all the appendices, I did want to comment on the second appendices in C, where the numbers are inflation adjusted. In future presentations of this or presentations before the full commission, could we get an additional one that shows the nominal numbers? Because I can see a legislator looking at this and saying, tuition really didn't increase that much over a 10-year period. And that's because you're using inflation adjusted numbers. So when you see U of O for 1188,836, that's an inflation number. The actual number for U of O, the nominal number, was 9703. So if you look at now what the tuition was in 23-24 and use 9703, I believe the increase is about 52% in nominal numbers. I mean, what you're doing by inflation adjusting is you're going back and saying that 9703 that was in 2314 for U of O is actually the equivalent to 11,836 today. And another way you could look at these numbers, if you actually looked at them as inflation adjusted in those percentages, is that's actually the percentage, at least in my mind, that the costs increase above the increase in CPI. So they increase considerably faster than CPI.
Commissioner Adams, do you have another question?
Yeah, I think Commissioner Devlin and I are kind of on the same wavelength on this. And I would say, Jim, it sounds like we want to talk about it. For me, it doesn't, the magnitude of the impact changes slightly, but the message I think is similar, which is we should talk about it. We should talk about it.
So, Jim, assume it'd be possible to present side by side both nominal data and inflation adjusted data, so we could see both of those and I think have a better understanding of what's going on there.
Sure, absolutely.
Great. Other questions or comments on this issue?
Well, I have one, and it has to do with the special assessments on different courses. And Jim, when you get to, I can wait for the question, but it's clear that that varies a great deal across campus. And I can't tell from the charts how much, for instance, at OSU, which has, I think, the most for more programs, how that, if we factored that into tuition, how it affects it and whether it's in the formula. But I think I know you've explained that one other year, but I just don't know. I'm not sure how concerned to be about it, but the more everybody is in a special program, the more concerned we are. So if you can kind of tailor your presentation now to get to where you know these big questions are, that would be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, Jim, I'd like to maybe piggyback on that comment. I have become, partly from my own experience of running an institution, but then again, most recently from my meeting with the leadership at Oregon State, raises questions for me about what we think we know when we look at, quote unquote, the tuition rate and how it changes from year to year, because there's such a wide array of actual costs the students' experiences at these institutions. Incredibly, I was talking at Oregon State about, the different tuition model that you use for their e-campus, which is their really only growing part of their institution. And so I wonder, how do we, I know you're trying to develop sort of models that help you to take into account all of these things, but it's hard to know what we know when we look at the quote unquote average or composite, whatever tuition increase from year to year, when I think there are a whole lot of students that don't experience it that way. I know, again, Oregon State's tuition at the Cascade campus is set separately from the OSU campus, and that surprised me when I was at their board meeting last week. And so just kind of maybe again, I think this is just restating Commissioner Rowe's question comment is how does all of this get, and can we gain a better understanding of how all of this is considered or not considered when we say tuition is increasing X amount, you know?
Yeah, certainly. I think a couple of comments. The first is that our authority, the HECC authority in statute, is to approve or consider increases in resident undergraduate tuition and mandatory fees that exceed 5% from one year to the next. And so, again, it focuses on resident undergraduate tuition and mandatory fees.
Right.
That's not to suggest non-resident tuition, undergraduate tuition isn't important. It is. Not to suggest graduate tuition isn't important. It is. Those are considerations and decision points made by the governing board, and they have purview over the totality of that. But for the purposes of resident undergraduate tuition and mandatory fees, if an institution, a public university, wants to raise that by more than 5%, they have to seek permission from either the HECC or the state legislature, technically in statute, but that's typically a responsibility afforded to the HECC. And when we, as HECC staff, look at that 5% threshold, and this is spelled out in a limited way in Appendix B on page 3, when we look at that threshold, we define tuition as the base tuition amount per credit hour charged by the university for 45 credits in a given academic year for resident undergraduate students. So again, base tuition amount, 45 credits. Differential tuition, I think to Commissioner Rowe's point, is not included in that calculation. And the reason is because we don't consider course fees either, which is kind of separate, right? So we do look at tuition and mandatory fees. We don't consider differential tuition. And for fees, mandatory enrollment fees, we include those that apply to all undergraduate students who are enrolled in a degree program who are qualified to pay resident tuition as a necessary condition of enrolling. And this is important simply because there are mandatory incidental fees that students pay. Those mandatory incidental fees, however, are set by the Student Government Association pursuant to ORS 352-105. So we do not include those in the calculation at all, the mandatory incidental fees, nor do we include course-specific fees. So like if the student enrolls for a music class and there's a fee for renting an instrument or something like that, or an art class and there's a fee for, art supplies. That's a fee, a course fee specific to enrollment in that class. We do not consider that as part of the mandatory tuition and fees, nor do we include fees for specific services. If there's like a parking fee, for example, if you have to buy a parking permit on campus, that's excluded from our analysis. So again, and from there, it's just what's the percent increase in those tuition and eligible fees pursuant to the 5% threshold. But for institutions that have multiple campuses, OSU, for example, with Cascades, Corvallis, we calculate a separate rate for each campus. For universities that have a cohort, approach, like University of Oregon with their guaranteed tuition program, each cohort of students, each class, you know, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, they pay a different rate slightly because of guaranteed tuition. So we take a weighted average approach. We calculate the rate for each cohort, each student cohort, and then we weight it based on their enrollment relative to, you know, proportional enrollment relative to the whole. eCampus is excluded because we don't know whether those students are resident or non-resident. So there's an argument to be made about, wait a minute, if most of the students enrolling are students walking around campus, but they're just enrolling online for flexibility and freedom, we don't necessarily consider that because it's online, not considered resident undergraduate necessarily within the confines of our current working definition. So that's why, and that's an issue that has kind of changed and evolved a little bit over time, because we get the persistent question about, wait a minute, I know a lot of those students are Oregon residents. Why aren't you charging them? Or why aren't you considering them? And the reason is typically because the institution will charge special fees or waive other fees for online students. So for example, you'll have a healthcare fee for students who are in person on campus. That healthcare fee will be waived for online students, right? So it's a tricky situation, and the overriding goal of this review, of our review, our intent is to conduct a holistic review. We're not looking at specific academic programs or specific students individually. We're trying to assess the overriding holistic, increase for those students who are enrolling as resident undergraduate students. So the eCampus students are not necessarily considered, for the purposes of our definition, as weird though that may sound, they're not considered resident undergraduate students. So,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
I know we're spending some time on this, but I think this is a good discussion. One of the areas that I have expressed an interest in before, and Ben said that they would be doing some work on it the last time I brought it up, is when the legislature put this in place, the 5%, I think they were thinking about the increased costs of public education for students and families in Oregon. And not that they were thinking the whole thing through, that when they kept down the tuition, they needed to increase the appropriations to be able to do that. But many of the institutions now, and I don't know how many, maybe I know that the first one to do this was, I believe, actually Western Oregon, that had guaranteed tuition, once you started. I know U of O has it, and I think some of the other institutions, but because of the way we compute the 5%, now fortunately U of O this year is only a 3% for incoming freshmen, but you could have an 8 or 9% for freshmen, and then freeze the others and be well under the 5%. So the overall cost of attending is going to go up faster than the average cost increase, because each new freshman class could be actually have tuition that's increased more than 5%, because how we compute it is the average of all those students. So if there's no increases for sophomores, juniors, and seniors, but all the increases on freshmen, you can increase the rate of tuition increase for entry into the university much faster. And I guess Ben said they would actually do some historical look at that. And I just like to see that what's been happening. So I mentioned his name, and he's on the video now. He just came in. So I just wanted to a good discussion here, and I wanted to get that other issue out.
Thanks. And I'll defer to Jim in a minute to speak to any of our understanding of the history on that. But I think one way, as I think most of you know, that it's even more that the actual tuition experience of students is even more dynamic than all of the examples we've given, because universities use individualized approaches, right, of discounting for some students, right, that is not encompassed within our approach here, right, and won't ever be, because we don't access that type of individual data. So what we're really trying to do, what this law I think is trying to do, is just sort of establish an overall standard, a sort of general expectation that on the whole things don't go over 5% without HECC approval. One way I think to kind of truth check whether our approach is, and this law is having the intended effect, and then our approach to our methodology, is to look historically at the tuition revenue, net tuition revenue per resident student, and see whether it, to the degree to which it matches our understanding of our calculation of their tuition increases year over year. And that's another piece of historical analysis. I don't have that in front of me, but I would expect it would show that actually when we show a university raising its resident tuition, undergraduate tuition rate by 3%, I think that the books would show that on a per student resident undergraduate student basis, they are generating about 3% of addition of new revenue, even though on a student by student basis, some students are experiencing a larger increase, others are experiencing a smaller one for some of the various reasons that we're describing here. And I don't know that there will ever be a methodology that sort of gets at that at a more individualized level, but I think it still has the effect of putting a check on. Jim, do you want to speak to any of this scenario that Commissioner Devlin has hypothesized, described, where there could be almost a loophole given these guaranteed flat rate approaches for students?
Ben, and I don't think it would be that hard just to look at the institutions, and I'm interested in what the entry cost is, and not with all the adjustments that some students may have. I mean, I'm looking for the student that doesn't have the adjustments, what the entry cost is into the institution, how fast that's increasing. Which, right. I mean, maybe not in our purview, because of how we've always computed this increase and computed what exceeds and does not exceed the 5%. It may not be in our purview, but it'd be interesting to look at to see what's actually happened to
sort of freshman rate year over year, the incoming student rate from one year to another. Well, Jim, you speak to this. I don't believe there's been any skewing there with higher rates of increase for freshmen than for others, even at schools like UVO and Western. But Jim, do you want to speak to that?
I do, and I'll make a couple of points. The first is that last year we did actually share the increase cohort by cohort compared to the prior year's cohort. So for U of O in particular, for OSU as well, because OSU is even a little bit more complicated because they use cohorts within each campus, right? So you'll have essentially like 5, 6, 7, 8 different sets of rates for their students based on cohort and then campus. But nonetheless, I think to your point, Commissioner Devlin, in terms of what is the entering freshman paying relative to what a freshman was paying the prior year, we actually calculate that. And last year when we went through this, I think it was in the May F&A, we actually showed that as part of the official calculation. So my plan is to do that yet again next month in May. We will have those detailed calculations that answer that question. Wait a minute, what were freshmen paying last year? And what are this incoming class of freshmen going to pay? And what's the increase there? But mathematically, undeniably, it could exceed 5%. You're right. And via the weighted average approach, the weighted average approach could be under the 5%. And so that's why we look at it cohort by cohort to try to assess, wait a minute, are you trying to increase a substantial amount? And so U of O has typically tried to stay under 5 for all their cohorts. But the challenge with a guaranteed tuition plan is that you're trying to forecast for the next 4 years what that rate will be. So the 6, 7, 8%, even if you raise 6, 7, 8% increase for entering freshmen, that's for 4 years. You're going to smooth that increase out over the 4 to 4.5, 5 years, or for some of us as undergrads, 6 or 7 years, their experience at the institution. And so it's a trade-off, right? On the one hand, you're right, you could see a higher than 5% increase for that entering freshman cohort class, but it smooths out over 4 years. So we've been working with U of O staff on kind of understanding those dynamics and how it all fits together. And they haven't been increasing it, in an egregious way. So they've just been trying to forecast their inflationary, cost increases, which has probably gotten a lot more challenging in the last couple of years. So
I understand that. Would it be possible though, just to look, I mean, you have the data to look at what the entry for freshmen is like over the last 10 years at each institution, just to see if there has been any pattern. I mean, because I think that was part of the legislature's concern. And again, I don't want to be critical of my former employer, but I do think that was a concern of the legislature, but I don't think they necessarily connect the fact that to keep tuition down, you have to actually increase appropriations.
Mm-hmm.
Or institutions like we have become more and more dependent on tuition,
Thank you. Commissioner Adams.
So Jim, it seems we're going to talk about this. If we're going to talk about it. I have a few thoughts, and I won't ask for more information because I feel like I have enough on this page to get a sense of the direction, which is what made my heart palpitate. I'll tell you a few things come to mind here. I assume that this Appendix C was some prior iteration of this committee asked for the 10-year information to get a sense over time. That's why it's here. And the scale of the increase for some of these institutions over 10 years doesn't match anything in financial markets. This is off the charts high. And if you assume that a third of those kids borrow and borrowing rates have increased, then the fully loaded cost is an order of magnitude higher after they pay it off. And I also took away from this page that the volatility in pricing, so to speak, for a year of college, by whatever measure you figure it out or you estimate it, is put on the student, right? It could go up 10% a year, it might go down 0.1%, but there's a lot of volatility. And in most markets and for most products, that volatility is not put on the party that has the power or that we want to benefit. So my overall takeaway from the information is these compounding growth rates, even on a 4-year basis, you don't even have to get to 10 years. I mean, if you look at, OSU Cascades 2014 to 2018 on a 4-year basis, the number is massive. And this is flashing red lights for me. And the detail helps to see who's most impacted, what the biggest problems are, but this change is telling me the kids are bearing more of the load is getting heavier, and they're taking the volatility. And I assume the point of having this appendix is to get us to raise the red flag when we have some concerns about the long-term effect of a year-over-year perspective on 5%. And I'm not sure what else it would take for us to be alarmed by the data. While you were talking, I did a quick search to see if I could find anything that has a 36.8% 10-year increase that we consume regularly, and there isn't, not even oil. So I would love to hear your view on what you think we should take from this literally, and then what the spirit of our mandate is in conveying its importance beyond this committee to the larger commission.
Chair,
Commissioner
can I pile on Commissioner Adams' question before Jim addresses it? Because this is, I don't know, 6 years ago, the first year on the board was when I started raising this without nearly the knowledge and eloquence you have. I think there are two things here, and Chair and Jim, I'm not sure how to address them. One is, of course, our legislative mandate, and that to me has never seemed sufficient. You know, they stay under 5 by our formula, and fine, they get to pass go. The other thing that's been a concern, and that Commissioner Devlin and Commissioner Adams are raising in much better focus, is our responsibility overall for affordability, and the burden that we are putting on students that many of us have emphasized as unsustainable. And also when you compare even the published, and I realize we're calculating it the same way as other states for the 5%, but when you compare Oregon's cumulative increases to other states, we look bad. So I think the question we're asking, and part of it is, what do we do with the authority we have to highlight this concern, to understand it better, to communicate with the universities, especially because our sort of point of major principle is that we represent the students. So anyway, it's how to get it, not our legislative delegated authority, but how to get at the much larger responsibility we feel regarding affordability in the state of Oregon for public education.
Commissioner Simnett.
Thank you, Commissioner Heyman. Chair of the F&A. I'm sorry, I'm like, it's my first time addressing you in this role. I just wanted to say that I too feel really alarmed by these numbers, and I feel like you see this cost and you see this burden, and it feels decontextualized in a sense. I just don't, and I think that because there isn't that context of where these numbers are coming from, what else are students paying? I mean, and I'm not saying that, I know it's not, we can't do like giant reports of all the numbers of all the costs and what's driving this tuition, but I feel like I need additional context to better understand what is happening, because it does feel like something's very, very alarming is happening, that there's this continued increase in cost. I also feel concerned that much of that tuition increase is that there is right up at that 5% I'm hearing, and that's what's happening around the state. And I guess I want to know more about where those increases are coming from, and I'd really like to hear some solutions, because as somebody who works on a college campus, I know that that increase in tuition it's not visible in seeing like a huge increase in services or wages of employees or other things. And so I think just having a better understanding of what's happening, what's driving this like just repeated increase in cost, beyond what we heard from the university presidents about what happened far in the past of disinvesting from public funds. But I really would appreciate knowing a little bit more about that. in order to be able to address some of what other commissioners have already raised about, you know, how can we act and fulfill our responsibility given the situation.
Commissioner Rowe, did you have another comment? Okay,
Mr. Chairman,
yes,
Um,
Commissioner Devlin.
I'll make it very quick. I do think we have to keep in mind that the thing that's causing this the most is the fact that the state's contribution to public education has declined so significantly over time as a percentage of the cost. I think in our last deliberations on the budget may have ended up a little bit different given the final budget, but not much. For what's called the, Pinkham knows the right acronym for it, but it's like the general fund for these institutions. You know, for every $4 increase in costs, students and families pay $3 of the dollars, and the state increases by 1. We pay now about 26% of those costs, and we used to pay a lot more. If you go back, you have to go back decades. And the reality is that costs are going to go up, but the state needs to be able to appropriate and make it a higher priority to appropriate for post-secondary public education to keep the costs for students and families down. That's the only way really to keep them down.
Thank you, Commissioner Devlin. If possible, or Director Cannon, did you want to add something here?
Well, I probably against my better judgment. I mean, I'm a little struck by the subcommittee's maybe not surprised. I'm not surprised at your consternation. But the actual mechanics here are not, and the causes or the reasons for them are not at all complicated. They are the result of institutions attempting to maintain programs and in some cases grow programs and services for students with rising public sector labor costs. The largest contributors over the last decade to those labor cost increases have been the cost of our public employees retirement system and healthcare. But especially in recent years, there's also quite a bit of contribution as the result of increased salaries. The state, I won't speak to the universities, but the state this last summer agreed to roughly 6.5% cost of living increases for state employees in each of 2 years. Similar dynamics with amongst other public employers. And at the institutional level, someone has to either you contract in the face of those increasing per employee unit costs. You either lay workers off or you pass along those costs. And in the case of our public universities, their options for passing along those costs are either to students or to the state. And of course, they don't really get to pass them on to the state legislature decides. And, you know, both have been scrambling, both the state of Oregon, which has been investing more in our public institutions to try to keep up with those cost increases largely, and students also sort of scrambling through these 3 to 5% annual tuition increases. And it's really hard if the state wants to assume a greater burden or can assume a greater burden, it can offset that need for tuition increases. But given the ratio, given where we are today on the ratio of state dollar to student dollar, and the fact that the state is now a minority contributor, it takes extra state effort. It takes much larger than the 5% increases in order to eat away at that tuition increase for students. So that's the dynamic. I'm not making any judgment here. I'm just explaining the basic hydraulics are actually quite, and causes, I think, are not difficult to understand.
Commissioner Adams, I'll take your question, and then we're going to try to move on.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Chair. I appreciate it. Director Cannon, I think what I'm learning here that's new is the cumulative the cumulative effect. I don't think I absorbed a 2 to 5% per year increase, what that has meant over time. And I think I'm processing what it means for the underlying asset, right? The education. What has happened here is that some of these institutions, a degree has gone from being an appreciating asset to a depreciating asset. That isn't, that you cannot justify financing. And the magnitude of the impact over time, understanding its drivers, is what I think I did not compute. And so it feels to me like the measure that triggers deeper inquiry, that a transactional measure is not enough. It feels like somehow we have to check in, like we do on financial statements, that connect that decision over time. That's the thing that I think I've been missing. The other thing I think I've been missing here is how much variation there is between the schools and what that means to the financial lives of students the 25 or so years after they graduate. I understood there would be variations in tuition, but holy cow, a difference between a 10% increase over 10 years and a 36.8% increase over 10 years. That's a lot. And so what I don't think I appreciated also was the intra-system variation in that. And so I feel like I want to understand this more over time and to think, well, is there a spirit of our mandate that is not specifically connected to the year-over-year transactional review? I have to tell you, as a numbers person, oh my God, it just made me think, oh my God, I've totally not understood this. And then have maybe missed the forest for the trees in looking at it on an annual basis.
Thanks, Commissioner Adams. We're going to try and move on. I want to offer, I am burdened or informed as a result of being a community college president for 17 years here. And so I have a strong sense of the institutions working in terms to address the tuition issue. And I, having just sat in on Oregon State's board's conversations around this issue, my impression is they're trying to be pretty creative in keeping down the cost of the student. It may not look like that way to us, but you know, I remember feeling like I was in a bind, and I certainly the Oregon State leadership feels, you know, they tell me that 80% of their costs are personnel. And almost all those increases are either in a COLA or in healthcare or in PERS. Completely uncontrollable issues from their perspective. Maybe there are ways to control those, but that's the, you know, and I remember that, you know, I remember when the legislature, and maybe Commissioner Devlin remembers this, when the state was in such a financial crisis that they actually withdrew part of their funding to education in the middle of a biennium. And institutions had to decide what they were going to do under that circumstances. And most institutions don't have the surpluses able to simply ride that out for a period of time. So we saw, in my institution, I think we saw 15% tuition increases in a single year. That is terrible.
Yeah.
But it was perhaps the least terrible of the options that we had. And I want to finish with going back, which I think something Commissioner Devlin intimated. The legislature's intent, I believe, was try to create a legislative understanding of the relationship between tuition and their support of higher education. And the only real way to keep tuition down was to increase state support, which is where we have been. And we haven't done that for the most part. And so we've seen tuition increase. And I also think that this is always what happens when you turn a goal into a statute. You create a metric, but it doesn't necessarily always achieve what you intended. And I think we as a commission need to think about, I think our interest is having a better understanding of what is the real cost to the student and how does that change over time, which is not the same thing as what was the percent increase in tuition in any given year. Those are two different things. I know the statute requires us to do what we're currently doing, Jim, but I think you're hearing that the commission is interested in something more holistic, more a deeper understanding of what this actually means for the students. That makes sense?
It does, and it's complicated, right? And it's complicated by exactly what you just described and kind of the piecemeal approach. And we're looking at one puzzle piece of a much larger picture. And I would offer that within our key performance measures, our KPMs, we have a measure of affordability that we track over time. And there's an effort, I think that's a better effort to keep abreast of that larger perspective of, you know, is higher education affordable or is it not for a student? That considers the total cost of a student's education, right? Not just tuition, but books and fees and living and housing and all that. And of course, when you look at a total cost of attendance, only about 45% of that cost is tuition and fees. The other 55% is housing and food. And over the last, 10, 15 years, that's grown substantially faster than tuition and fees in some cases. So how do you measure that? And so one of our key performance measures is this idea of affordability. What percent of students can't afford to pay for college, even with all their financial aid and by working a part-time job of 15, 20 hours a week? What percentage of students can't afford it? And is that number going up or down from year to year? And so I think our key performance measures do a bit of a better job of kind of holistically stepping back and viewing it through the lens of the student. Are we maintaining a level of affordability or are we not? And I won't dwell on that, but I know that's data that Dr. Amy Cox and her folks in research and data do a great job of putting that information together every year, something that is brought to the commission every November, December timeframe. And so we'll have more information on that, but I think that will be the connection. And also too, a little bit later during this meeting, where we talk about our ARB from a policy perspective and kind of what mechanisms you have at your disposal, to what levers you can control. To touch on Senator Devlin's point, he's 100% right. Back in 1998, to pick a random date, the state contributed 44% of the funding for our public universities, and now they're only contributing about 24%. So the flip of that is that back 20, 25 years ago, students were providing through tuition and fees 47% of the cost. Now they're contributing about 70% of the cost, right? So that, I think, touches on an answer to your question, Commissioner Adams, about why have we seen such an acceleration in tuition? It's not only because of what Ben described, but it's also because of the offset between fewer state dollars and inevitably leads to the necessity of collecting more tuition dollars. And so those two play a role together. But I think over time we'll get into kind of the other puzzle pieces, and my hope is that it'll frame out a much larger understanding. And if it doesn't, hold me to that. If it doesn't, we'll keep working on it.
Thanks, Jim. One of the suggestions I would make is, if that is true, then while this report in a sense meets the requirements of the statutorily required reporting, is there a way in which we could take all those different ways in which we could look at affordability and bring them to the table at the same time, so we could have that more comprehensive conversation? I would also like to add, I do like the data point of you know, tuition and fees revenue per FTE. That's another data point that I think is very helpful, but a way of bringing that all to the table at the same time so we can have a more comprehensive understanding of what this really means for the real student who goes to one of our institutions. It sounds like we have it, and we just don't get it all at the same time. And I have a little hard time putting the puzzle together when I get the pieces 4 months apart from each other. So, okay.
Can do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been really helpful to me, and we're going to move forward. You know, we were like 20 minutes ahead of time, and now we're 20 minutes behind time. So great, great. We're going to move on to a financial conditions report, which I believe is Jim's topic again, and I want to just call our attention to the summary page of that document, just to remind us why this is done. And I also wanted to thank Jim and everybody else who has worked on, this is a different report than we have had in the past. It is a sort of a progressive step to do, I think, a better job of helping us to have a clear picture of the financial conditions of our universities. And so just in the middle of that summary sort of introductory page, it reminds us that we are looking that the purpose of this is to provide advance warning of financial instability for us who are policymakers, to identify potential systemic risks within the infrastructure as it relates to the education workforce missions of our institutions, and then just to help us maintain a broader awareness of financial trends within education itself, and perhaps in Oregon, but perhaps as it compares to other ones as well. And so, Jim, I thank you for this report, and I'm ready for you to make your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. I will bring up a slide deck to walk through briefly. I'm hoping that this will show up appropriately here. Let me switch. And so we do have, and I appreciate those kind words, Mr. Chair, that we do have a bit of a different report. And so it does, in my mind, necessitate some explanation. It does, however, too, kind of assume that you have a basic understanding of how some of the university finances work. And so just as a refresher, we did, as part of the materials, docket item 4.0C, we did post a 2-page kind of overview on university finances where we kind of reference fund accounting and some other issues that are unique just to help serve that basic understanding. So I hope that's useful, but I do want to talk a little bit about the background, the condition analysis, and then the trend analysis. And as the chair mentioned, we do have a 3-pronged purpose statement that we did kind of lay out back in November to provide advance warning, identify those risks, and maintain an awareness. As to, and again, the overriding purpose of this financial monitoring work is to support your statewide policy making guided by the goals and missions of public higher education. And so we won't ask you to take action on this report. You don't have to vote to accept it or do any of that stuff. But what we're trying to do here is really not just provide advance warning of financial instability, but also identify those broader trends that could influence some of the decision making around our ARB and the differing levels of funding we may consider requesting from the state legislature and the governor. And so maintaining that awareness is a big component of why we're doing this work. I will offer a general outlook for higher education on slide 4 here. This comes verbatim from Moody's, the really intelligent people at Moody's, who you may know do credit rating analysis for bonds that get sold. They have different sector analyses, reports that they provide. Higher education is one of the sectors that they analyze, and they offer a rating of the sector as in total. So they rate the sector, and this is a forward-looking rating for the next 12 to 18 months. They rate higher education as stable. They note improving revenue, cooling inflation, this morning's inflation report aside, and state financial reserve levels as well. So I won't read this to you, but I always am interested in where Moody's and the other credit rating bureau folks think higher ed is going to go, because I think they do a good job of kind of teasing out, some of these challenges, right? The long-term student demand uncertainty is a real issue nationally that higher education is dealing with. Persistent expense pressures and challenging labor dynamics. I think an echo of Ben's comments just a few minutes ago is important, because that will set the stage for some of the challenging budget conversations that are occurring at the campus level. So the outlook in general is important, but as we dig into the financial condition analysis, we are taking a bit of a different approach than the previous reports, noting full well there's no singular method that's perfectly capable of forecasting challenges or distress or a closure, but based on research recently conducted, influenced by research recently conducted, as noted at the bottom of this chart, we're using a simplified approach that has a higher likelihood of predicting instability, but a simplified approach. We're not trying to look at 13, 15 different metrics. There are lots of different financial metrics that could be considered. And I do want to call attention to the fact that many of our education partners at the universities, they use for their own boards some of the ratios we use, but they use more. So they get into a lot more detail specific with their governing boards that we don't get into. But our approach uses currently available data. And in the past, we had used annual audited financial statement data to calculate the financial ratios. We are now using IPEDS data to do that. It's simpler, it's easier, and it's reflective of what the institutions report to the federal government. And that's important to me, because they can report the best and highest quality data they can. And so we'll just use that data. But here in the middle of this chart, we're using essentially four metrics. We're looking at an enrollment, the trend in enrollment over time. We're looking at 3 financial ratios, which I'll speak to in more detail in just a second. We're looking at a reliance on state funding in particular. And then we're looking at other qualitative factors that include their annual audits and substantial leadership turnover, any known sanctions or investigations, kind of those, that other category. On the right-hand side, I offer some summary comments that are included in the report itself, which is also posted as part of the materials for this meeting. I have to pause and express appreciation for the hard work of the staff in public post-secondary finance and capital, PFC, for putting all the information in this report. They really did a good job over the last 3 months in creating this 30-page report. But this summary commentary is just a quick sentence or two for each one of those 4 metrics. The metrics, again, 4 components, that's kind of the intended report card, if you will. And so if you're looking at the financial report itself on page 5, you'll see in table 1 for each one of the 7 universities, essentially a report card across those 4 metrics. Just a quick note on the financial ratios. It's important that I define up front financial sustainability is what we're trying to assess. And that financial sustainability is relative to 2 components. First being the ability to carry out activities that will achieve the mission, kind of think in short term, over the short term, while also developing and maintaining that capacity for mission relevance over the long term. So we have to look at both short-term performance and long-term capacity together, help us assess financial sustainability. We use 3 financial ratios, one to assess that short-term performance, and two, to assess that long-term capacity. And those are the questions we're trying to address with those ratios. It's important to note that the calculations include all funds. So the general fund, all funds, auxiliary fund, the whole kit and caboodle, including the foundation for the university. And that can be somewhat controversial. That is an industry best practice. I'll leave it at saying that some of our universities disagree, but we include the foundation and we adjust for certain liabilities, assets, and expenses specific to their pension liabilities and other OPEB assets and liabilities and related expenses. So that's just a real quick preview of the 3 financial ratios that we assess. And then again, in the report on page 5, you'll see an assessment across all 3 ratios for each one of the 7 universities in an effort to just keep it as simple as we can. But that is the first kind of prong of the purpose statement, is how we provide that advance warning. As we look to identifying potential systematic risks, this is where we focus more narrowly on their general fund by itself. So when we looked at the financial ratios, we look across the entire university, all funds, including the foundation. In this instance, when we're looking at financial trend data, we're really focused on the general fund by itself. And in the report on page 12, we give you a 5-year trend collectively combined for all 7 universities. But we noticed that in the past 2 years, after we've exited the pandemic, spending is growing faster than revenue. And that's going to make it difficult for the universities to balance their spending within available revenue. We also know collectively they're more reliant on state funding. That's not necessarily good or bad. It just means from a risk management perspective, what happens if state revenue is a little more volatile than it has been historically? That could add certainly a measure of risk. And then financial reserves have improved over the past 5 years, but it's important to note the recent year-over-year trend shows a slight reduction, again, as we exit the pandemic and return to kind of pre-pandemic cost experiences. So in the report, I think this is the section starting on page 13 to page 17. I think this is the section where we really try to lay out these broader trends, the broader big picture trends that could affect their financial sustainability in the near term and the long term. We really tried to be succinct, but also provide enough information to really get a good grasp and handle on the challenges they could face. So we start with demographics and student demand. So we have heard a lot about an enrollment cliff, and we've heard recently of that enrollment cliff accelerating. But these enrollment headwinds and demand uncertainty may very well continue to suppress the growth in operating revenues specifically. Again, it's going to be very difficult for the universities to manage that if non-operating revenue, i.e. state revenue, doesn't keep pace with the growth in the cost experience. And we talk more about that on pages 13 and 14, where we talk about the specific demographics of Oregon, being that in the near future, we expect the population of Oregon to be older, to be more diverse, and we note that the institutions and their financial sustainability will likely not be served well by expectations of substantially higher enrollments of resident students under age 25. So going forward, moving forward in the next 5, 8, 10 years, the institutions cannot expect that they're going to just enroll more students who are traditional college-age students. They're going to have to focus on adult students. They're going to have to focus on non-residents. They're going to have to focus on serving more students who are likely first generation in college as well. and that will change how they potentially organize themselves in the near term. Inflation is another challenge. As most of us are aware, in the last few years, we've seen elevated levels of inflation compared to historical averages. In the last 6 to 8 months, those inflation levels are coming down. You may or may not have noticed that there was a CPI inflation report just this morning that came out. I think inflation was at 3.4%, a little bit higher than expected. But these elevated levels of inflation often are delayed in how the cost experience plays out at the institution. That's an inelegant way of me saying that the growth in wage increases trails the inflation, right? So wages are just now starting to catch up with that historically high inflation levels from 12 to 18 months ago. So in the near term, and I think Ben referenced this nicely, where we're going to see some cost pressure. We're going to see some expense pressure relative to wages in the next 12, 18, 24 months. Sustainability is going to be an issue as well. Just in general, capacity building as an element of sustainability is going to be challenging if the growth in revenue doesn't keep pace with the growth in spending. It's going to be really difficult to balance the budget, to make sure that you're spending within means if you're a university board member trying to make these decisions. And finally, I'll point out state funding. Recent increases have been great and have had a positive impact on student affordability. I mentioned our key performance measure on student affordability. Amy and her team did report that we saw an improvement in student affordability for the first time in a rather long time. So growth in state funding recently over the past 2-3 biennia has been fantastic, but it has not altered the long-term transfer of that cost burden from state to student, right? So, and as Ben noted in his commentary just a few minutes ago, reversing that is going to take substantial increases in funding. And so can the state afford to do so is an open question, especially as on page 17 of the report, we note over time, going back to 1980, the funding per FTE in Oregon has trailed the national average anywhere from 15 to 30%. So we've had this historical trend where the funding per student in Oregon has trailed the national average. Can we reverse that? Can we change that? Will we have the capacity to do that? I'll leave you with just a couple of comments. One of the recommendations we made this last November was to add the community colleges to this financial monitoring work and to this financial conditions report. It is our intent to do that starting with next year's report in 2025. In the meantime, we have formed a collaborative work group with the colleges to make a set of recommendations on how to do that. We had our first meeting with that work group just last week, I believe, or the week before. It is our intent to continue meeting with that work group 3 or 4 times over the next few months, and then have that work group make a set of recommendations in collaboration with HECC staff in October. And then our goal is to have a framework ready for your consideration during the November F&A meeting, so we can lay out what that will actually look like within the report for next spring. So that work is ongoing, and I just wanted to draw your attention to that. And then I think, Mr. Chair, I am done with those slides and can entertain questions at this point.
Thank you, Jim. I'm sure we have questions. I'm going to ask a favor, Jim, especially. I want to make sure we get all of our questions on the table and not run our meeting till 4 o'clock tonight. So perhaps, if possible, try to more comprehensively respond to the questions tomorrow when these items come up again. But I think hopefully what we can do now is to let you know to help you to anticipate the questions that you will get. So I'm sure there are questions I'd like to ask commissioners as you have any. I have a few, so, but I'll wait. Maybe I won't. So I want to go to page 5, Jim, of the report, metrics thing. And so just as an example, I look at one, there's one point in it that says in crisis. Now, those words mean a lot to me. And I know you go into more detail to explain, what that specifically means. But as a commission, I'm interested in how in crisis is a big word, a big concept, and what do we anticipate the commission should do when we are told that a critical message for an institution, a critical metric for an institution is in crisis? And I'm wondering, so in other words, is it sort of a next step in an evolving report? Says, okay, now we have this, what do we do? And I feel uncomfortable getting a report that says some critical metric for an institution that is in crisis, and we go, oh, okay, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think it's important to note first that the assessment language we're using for each one of the metrics is informed by work recently completed by NACUBA, which is the National Association of College and University Business Officers, in conjunction with a firm called Baker Tilly. So NACUBA and Baker Tilly partnered over the last year and published a report called The Path to Financial Sustainability that really speaks to regional public universities. There's growing national concern about regional public universities in particular and their long-term financial sustainability, as we are concerned here in Oregon. And we have other related policy work around working with TRUST plus PSU on financial sustainability. The state legislature, to their credit, appropriated $25 million to the HECC for that work, and we have ongoing collaboration with them to better understand that. I think what I would offer is that it's important that for enrollment, it says in crisis, and that simply means that in the last 2 years, their enrollment has decreased by greater than 10%. Their board is aware of it. Their president is aware of it. I don't know that it's necessarily a call to action for us as the commission, but I think it's helpful as part of a larger contextual understanding of the challenges our TRUs face in terms of enrollment. You'll notice that all of the TRUs are really kind of struggling for enrollment purposes. And that can mean any number of things. I think first and foremost, it means that we need to maintain an awareness of how that translates to not just their current financial condition, but how that could translate long-term to serving the students in our state. What I would hate to see happen, and I would be shocked if the board members of the universities disagreed, what I don't think any of us want to see is the service to our students being affected and their ability to complete and their ability to succeed being negatively affected. So what I think it would likely translate to us is perhaps, it could lead to a conversation with their board around what does that look like, right? What does your long-term financial sustainability look like, but what does it look like in terms of your service to students and helping students continue to be successful in completing in alignment with our statewide higher education goals, right? The bigger picture question is 40-40-20, our higher education goal, is attaining that goal in jeopardy because of these enrollment metrics? And so that's a tough question to answer, but that's where I think, just having this conversation and being aware of it could influence ARB conversations, budget conversations, how we talk with state legislature about, the direction of the higher education infrastructure in our state. And so I don't know if I'm really answering your question more so than I'm saying it's difficult for me to say, hey, here's this report, here's an assessment, but I'm not asking you to take any action on it, right? And I know that you want to roll your sleeves up and take action, right? How can we work on this? How can we fix it? How can we address it? But I think an awareness of it is enough because it will inevitably tie into the policy work that we as a commission engage in.
Yeah, I guess I would agree with one of the comments you made. I don't think you answered my question. I want to continue. I don't think a heightened awareness is an appropriate response to a document statement that says an institution is in crisis in any way. And so I'm asking that in the long run, not today, but in the long run, we think about. I don't want to get used to having documents that tell me that institutions are in crisis and we go, oh, we're more aware. Okay. I want to have a conversation about what does this mean? And I would also add, I want us to think in terms of how is this report helpful to the institutions themselves? So it promotes the kind of dialogue that you're talking about. It says, okay, we've now benchmarked something that we call in crisis. We don't want to remain in crisis. What do we do? So
I will say too, real quickly, that this report in draft form was shared with all the universities for them to react to, for them to ask questions, to help us validate the calculations. And so they have seen this report. They do have a copy of it.
I understand that. I want to not dominate. Other questions, comments before we move on to our next topic? Commissioner Adams.
Thank you, Chair. Jim, what an exciting day. In looking at this data, I put it side by side with Appendix C from Section 3.0. And I think that together, we're something important. There's something important being said. So I understand your point about how the in crisis label is applied and that there's a working group getting into it, and maybe this committee's or this commission's role is not to actively advocate as a result of the report, but the two together are starting to say something really important, right, about the student experience. And one of the, I would love to chat more about this. One thing I'm seeing is that the price volatility for the student is not necessarily flowing through to make the university or institution more stable. So there's something happening in these two bodies of data that I would like to spend some more time later in the year on learning. And I share the chair's discomfort with seeing the information and then not acting on it. I don't quite know what to do with it. So that's my statement. But looking at them side by side, it seems like there's some important thing we should take in.
Thank you, Commissioner Adams. Commissioner Sumner.
Thank you, Chair Heyman. I just want to say I also share discomfort in seeing the in crisis label and to see actually so many of the institutions in the struggling -2 category in multiple areas. But that said, I appreciate like thinking about this contextually with the information from the tuition report, and in addition to the information that you mentioned would be able to put together about the overall cost of student expense. For me, I think having these contextual pieces continually, us being reminded of all of the contextual pieces as we're talking about and looking at this kind of report and seeing things like in crisis and struggling, it is really helpful in helping us have a full picture of the situation so that we aren't trying to solve a problem or racing to put effort towards making an impact without seeing the full picture. And anyway, I just want to also say I appreciate all of the work and the clarity of these reports and presentations.
Thanks, Commissioner Simnett. Any other questions or comments? Oh, Commissioner Adams. Oh, you're done. Okay. All right. Anything else on this topic? Jim, I appreciate the progress we're making in this area. I want to let you know that. I'm just kind of going to keep pushing for more because I think we're heading in the right direction. I really sincerely appreciate that and the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations that I think will lead to more. I think putting the commission in a better position to be helpful and provide policy leadership in areas that are critical to our institution's future. I also wanted just to add that in my meeting with one of the community colleges last week, they commented on this work to create a similar document for the community colleges, which I'm very supportive of our doing. So I want to be that. But they asked the question that I guess I want to restate is how can we construct this and represent this in a way that is helpful to the institutions? Not, oh, they agree with the data, but how it becomes a useful document to them. And I think the community colleges are going to ask that question of us as we pursue the work with them. So thank you very much. We're ready to move on to the next topic, which is also Jim's. This is the 2025-27 ARB on the HECC budget overview and process.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. It's perhaps maybe too much time with me today, but nonetheless, this is going to be a conversation, big picture about policy and how these different mechanisms relate to one another. So in a strategic way, so how do we align these policies and these levers at our disposal? So this will be a budget conversation, yes, but it won't be focused on budget numbers, and it won't be a detailed conversation about the different areas of our budget necessarily, although we will speak in a limited way about that at the very beginning of the slide deck that I'll bring up and share in just a second. But in a more important way, I think, as we start to endeavor to look at our 25-27 ARB, how do these different policy areas, how do they align? How do we fit them together in a strategic way? That's really the gist of this conversation, which I hope I can do justice as we start the journey toward August, where at the full commission we ask you to weigh in on a proposed ARB. But to begin with, we do have just our strategic map, and we start with a process overview. And so the budget process here in Oregon has kind of three major phases. The agency request budget developed in even years based on DAS CFO guidelines. Budgets are submitted to DAS by September 1. This includes the CSL or current service level, and I'll speak to that in just a second. But then the next stage after that is the governor's request budget, or GRB, which is reflective of the governor's priorities, budget policies, and current law, usually created and available in December, which then leads to the legislatively adopted budget, which of course is the legislative process during the 2025 session. The budget does, of course, it's a true two-year budget. It covers 2 fiscal years. The current biennium 2023-25, which we're in now, covers fiscal year 2024 and fiscal year 2025. Next biennium's budget will cover fiscal years 26 and 27. 7. Just to give you a very big overview of our budget, which you'll see again tomorrow morning as well at the full commission. You'll have kind of a budget update, but our current agency budget, all funds, all departments, all programs is $4.1 billion. And you'll see we break this out kind of in policy areas. So 2.3 billion of that is for institution support. This includes the Public University Support Fund, the Community College Support Fund. This includes statewide public services, outdoor school program, the sports scholarships, state programs, OHSU funding of 140 million or so for them. So that's funding that passes through us to the institutions. For the Public University Support Fund, the Community College Support Fund, of course, we use funding distribution formulas to allocate those dollars. But this also includes $968 million, 968 million or so for capital construction and debt service. Debt service alone is about $603 million, which includes not just general fund debt service and lottery fund debt service and other funds. It includes institution paid debt service as well. You'll see 411 for financial aid, 317 for workforce, and then 3% of the total is for the operating budget. So the institution support and capital construction and debt service totals about just under 80%. Financial aid, workforce together about 18-20%. So what I want to do is talk about those three kind of big policy areas and kind of how they align and how they fit together and how to think about them. You'll notice real quickly at the top the different phases, right? So the 21-23 budget for last biennium was 3.92 billion. We were at CSL of 3.3. ARB came in at $5.3 billion. And then the GRB was 3.7. We were actually appropriated 4.1. I will point out that this does not include about 24 million or so that just got appropriated during the short session. But the type of funding is important. About 70% is general fund revenue, 20% of other fund revenue. A lot of that is for debt service, and then a little bit of lottery money and a little bit of federal money as well. So when we talk about timelines and commission touch points, it's important to note first that the ARB that you'll see come August at the full commission will include the current service level budget and any policy option packages that we include. And there are throughout April, May, and June, there are touch points each and every month, largely through this body, the Funding and Achievement Subcommittee, to talk about, CS next month in May. We'll have external partners. They're going to do presentations. We'll talk about the current service level calculations. June, we'll have staff presentations on all those pass-through components, including financial aid and workforce. And then we'll have discussion of LCs and POPs that will likely occur at the full commission. And then in August, we'll have at that full commission meeting the ARB for your consideration and potential improvement. And I want to pause here as I point out that the ARB will be current service level plus POPs. I want to pause here to get Ben involved in the conversation because I think he has a late breaking update for us on that topic. So
yeah,
Ben.
so I'm going to share a little bit more about this year's process for developing the agency request budget. And there's a bit of awkwardness in the timing because the focus of Jim's presentation is to engage the Funding and Achievement Subcommittee in some consideration of these policy levers and how we use them or can use them to express the Commission's priorities and advance Oregon towards its state goals for higher education and workforce development. So really big picture. I though want to take this moment to get really somewhat technical for a moment because it has potentially big implications for how you put together your agency request budget this year. So typically the commission's agency request budget has been an expression really of its values and a response to the statutory requirement that every 2 years this commission present a budget recommendation to the governor for meeting the state's higher education goals. And as a result, this agency request budget, this kind of has been I would say, a very ambitious and aspirational document. It has said last year, for example, in 2022, for the 2023-25 biennium, it presented a recommendation to quadruple, roughly, state funding for financial aid for low and middle income students. Not because this commission believed necessarily that it was highly likely that the governor or the legislature would find the kind of capacity and resources to make that kind of investment, but to really set a marker. And that's consistent with practice of the commission going back to its inception. Yesterday, state agencies received direction from the governor and the chief financial office that our agency request budgets should take a very limited approach to requests for new funding. And except for certain priority areas of the governor that will be familiar to you, housing, behavioral mental health, early childhood education, except for in those areas, the governor's expectation is that agencies like the HECC will be limited in our request for new funding over and above the current service level, which Jim will describe in a little more detail in a minute, but for new funding over and above CSL to about a 1% increase, or about pops that are equivalent of about 1% of our current 2023-25 budget. Strictly construed at 1%, that would mean that the HECC's total request for new funding above CSL would be limited to $31 million total for institutions, for state grant programs, for workforce investments, etc. As I said, we received this message yesterday, this letter yesterday from the governor's chief of staff, having followed up over the last 24 hours with staff from the office of the chief financial office and the governor's office. I think there's a desire on the part of the governor to ensure that not to shortcut dialogue, right? A desire for partners and for boards and commissions like the HECC to go through a process and take consideration of what needs are, and not to sort of foreclose that. An openness to some conversation about potential flexibility in that cap, right? And so I think we'll learn more in the weeks or months to come about where we may get some of that flexibility in our formal agency request budget. I also think there's an openness on the governor's part and the office of the chief financial office to this commission, even as it submits an agency request budget that may be very different from prior ones in adhering to a much stricter cap, an openness to hearing from this commission through some other vehicle, imagine a letter or a memo or some other document, an expression of this commission's perspective, values, needs for post-secondary education and training, even if those aren't reflected in the formal agency request budget. I wanted to put that on the table because it absolutely conditions the work that we are doing at a staff, and it will condition the work that we're doing at a staff level to support you in the development of an agency request budget. It means, for example, that we are unlikely to be making a recommendation for an $800 million investment in our student financial aid programs as we did 2 years ago. It means that we will be in continued dialogue with the governor and the CFO to understand where we may be able to get some flexibility, for example, in workforce needs that are really, I think, critical for meeting the governor's goals around housing, behavioral mental health, education, et cetera. There may be an appetite there for us to get some additional flexibility, and we'll be working with you on a potential avenue to express this commission's perspective in ways besides the formal agency request budget. So I will share a version of this again during my executive director comments tomorrow morning. But given that that this presentation is about the budget development process and sort of budget and talks a lot about the ARB, and we learned just yesterday that this ARB will have some pretty strict limits placed on it by the governor, I wanted to note that here.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for giving us that, I think, very helpful update on process for this term. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
Ben,
Commissioner Devlin.
you're clearly indicating there, though, that, I mean, we may have some other mechanism. But at the same time, the commission is clearly empowered to point out potentially the difference between the objectives that the commission has adopted and the budget we are proposing, in terms of the conflict between those and the fact that we probably in many cases cannot meet those objectives with that budget. One of the questions I have, and I'm maybe going backwards in a sense, but one of the problems we have with entities that are not, in a sense, state agencies, and the universities and community colleges are both not state agencies. Now, clearly, the community colleges have always been independent. The universities are kind of quasi-independent. They perhaps don't like that term, but they're quasi-independent. But is what they assume in CSL, it appears here that they're still going back to the assuming only standard inflation for employee salaries. And that seems quite contradictory to DAS's position in the last two bienniums, where they've made very strong cases for state agencies for extremely high increases over previous years in the amount set aside to settle various collective bargaining agreements. If you just assume a lower rate for all of the personnel, which is a huge number in universities, your CSL is actually probably lower than what is realistic, depending upon what inflation is, depending upon a lot of other factors. I don't just think this would preclude us from pointing out that our CSL number is not an adequate number. And of course, CSL is simply the ability to do the same next year that you did this year. It's not that it's adequate last year or it's going to be adequate next year. It's just to do the same.
Absolutely. And we're in the process right now of gathering that information from public universities and community colleges in order to assert, as we have in the past, what I don't know, true CSL, we struggle a bit with the language because there is the formal DAS defined state CSL. Typically, to your point, Commissioner Devlin, there is a separate calculation that we've worked with institutions on and vetted that identifies what sort of the actual current service level costs are. And for example, 2 years ago, this commission advocated within its ARB for that level of funding for the colleges and universities. That required POPs because it was not incorporated within the DAS determined CSL. It was in a sense considered new, above CSL funding. And my expectation is that we'll be running those numbers again this cycle. And as you said, pointing out whether it's directly in the ARB or through some separate document, the consequence of failing to fund at that level.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, you have more?
I do, yes. And in fact, I think that conversation was a perfect segue into the next slide, which does talk about CSL. And so for the uninitiated, this is kind of in big picture terms. On the right-hand side, when we talk state budget build, it's a base plus approach that then equals the CSL. And so a key component of calculating the current service level for state agencies is looking at the positions themselves for the purposes of wages. For the independent institutions, to Commissioner Devlin's point, for the universities and the community colleges, folks over at DAS CFO, they do not have position level data for the institutions. And so they often assume the standard inflation rate for non-state employees, which does not fully include cost of living adjustments that will then be negotiated next biennium. So for them, we use what we call a blended rate approach for the Public University Support Fund, the Community College Support Fund. That blended rate approach, the intent is to use actual cost for benefits, including pension-related bond debt service, to minimize any variances between the CSL calculation and the institution's projections. But there is always a gap between the two, and that's reflective of the wage increase rate, because we ask the institutions in their expression of base funding to include those cost of living allowance increases that are not included for state agencies. So we'll next month in May, I'm hoping that we'll have the actual calculations, and we can walk through a little bit more at that time. As Ben notes, we're currently working on that with our partners at DAS and LFO. But then when we get to the rest of the work that we as HECC staff are doing over the next few months for institution support, and this kind of timeline on the left is important because we just last week collected a lot of the information that we need to support these requests. We spend the month of May calculating CSL, working to understand the underlying hydraulics between the consolidated funding request, financial requests that come in from the institutions. And we also, at the May F&A, we schedule partner presentations. And so as opposed to the meeting today where you're hearing pretty much all solely from me, next month in May, I'll speak for, I hope, 10, 15 minutes, and then the rest of the meeting will be from our partners. We're going to invite the Oregon Community College Association, the Oregon Council of Presidents, the Oregon Student Association, and we'll have a panel of workforce partners and a panel of financial aid partners. So it'll be a lot of presentations to inform our thinking and understanding of what those recommendations should be. And then in June, we make staff recommendations and presentations. The guidance we gave to the institutions to establish that level of base funding, we told them to assume the same level of enrollment, the same level of programs, same level of staffing. And it's important to, another way to think of that is we essentially said, don't assume any transformative or structural changes, which we know may be ongoing at any rate across the institutions. The requests do focus on their E&G mission, so we don't include auxiliary or any other funds. And we gave them a number of funding scenarios, anywhere from minus 10% to plus 20%. And we also asked them, what would it look like if you cap tuition fee increases at no more than 5%? And then we asked for additional information around the impact to underrepresented students at those differing levels of funding scenarios. The components on the right-hand side, CCSF, PUSF, statewide public services, and the public university state programs. I won't belabor and get into all those details, but if you are interested, you can find out a whole lot more information about each one of those in a report called the State Funding and Formula Summary Report, which has newly been updated for the current biennium and was posted with the meeting materials. It is docket item 5.0B, and it gets into a lot of detail around that. On the capital construction side, very similar approach. We are charged with recommending a consolidated higher education budget, including strategic investments for capital improvements and deferred maintenance. So we make a request of the institutions. We ask them to submit projects. We go through a process by which we rank order those projects using a rubric You may recall we discussed the rubrics last November in a little bit of detail, and we'll share in June when we make our recommendations more information on the rubrics and how we came up with the scores and the rankings, and we'll get into a lot more of those details then. But suffice it to say, we're going to spend the next couple of months going through all these projects. Next week, we have a meeting with the community colleges because we ask for community college presidents to help us score those packages. And so that'll be occurring next week. And then later in the month of April, we're going to be visiting the public universities and walking through the facilities that are a part of the 11 projects that the universities have submitted for consideration. So a lot of staff work done in April, May to prepare for the June presentations and recommendations that we make. This is where we transition away from kind of process to policy and potential strategic alignment. So this chart, it looks a little bit busy on the left, but we try to tease out the flow of funds to our institutions and to our students. And on the right, we note that there are essentially 4 main components of finance policy, right? There's funding for general operations, the PUSF, the CCSF, and as a commission, you get to make recommendations on that. There's also funding for student financial aid programs, OOG, the Oregon Promise, and we get to make recommendations on that as well. And so those are 2 big levers that we have at our disposal to influence student affordability and alignment with our state goals. There's also institutional student financial aid policy. So think remission policies, think local scholarships, resident student scholarships and waiver programs. So we have no control over that, the boards do, but there's, we hope an alignment between them, and many of those programs are structured around our state's higher education goals, focusing on underrepresented students, focusing on Pell eligible students or those students who demonstrate having the highest financial need. In Oregon, we have a 4th kind of lever at our disposal, which is funding for workforce programs. And I say that because in other states, workforce programs are funded through an entirely different state agency, but in Oregon, they're with us here at the HECC, which is a great thing. But you can see on the chart on the left that the funding we get from state and local government goes to higher ed, and then through student aid and appropriations and grants. Those are the 2 main policy levers. The funding for workforce programs is on the appropriations grants side, underscored with the red. When we're talking about what creates effective financing policy, then we lay out a few criteria, and this is informed by work done through the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems from Dennis Jones. So essentially criteria to be effective, it should be consistent with the goals of the state, right? It should be aligned with state goals. The capacity necessary to meet said priorities must be created and sustained, right? So the funding has to be in some terms adequate, right? And I think it's important to note and underscore what Senator Devlin said. CSL budget might not necessarily be adequate, right? So what is adequate funding? The contributions required must be within the means of those footing the bill, whether it be the student or state government. And this, I think, is also, too, a measurement of affordability. From the student's perspective, this is how we measure affordability. Is it within their means to foot the bill? Can they pay for it, yes or no? And that ties to one of our key performance measures. All parties in the equation must feel they are being treated fairly and getting a fair share, and the mechanisms by which funding is distributed must be transparent. I think it's important on the right-hand side, Dennis Jones and the folks at NCHAMS would say, states have really 2 direct tools, institution support funding and financial aid funding. The trick is to balance them and design the specifics in a way that yield the most effective results. I think here in Oregon, we have 3 direct tools: institution support funding, workforce funding, and financial aid funding. So how do all 3 of those tools work together to create the conditions for success? At the bottom, just a quote that I like: in terms of states must align finance policies with their current changing demographics, with their governance structure and their fiscal situation. So this is a way of saying that the real world is a bit messy. And obviously, how we choose to align those 3 tools will be informed by the state's fiscal situation. I think just having heard Ben say that this ARB cycle will be a little bit different than the others because of our fiscal situation. So I want to talk a little bit about impact. So as we get into, more of a discussion around the 3 tools that we have at our disposal: institution support funding, workforce funding, and financial aid program funding. What are the impact of those tools? If we decrease funding, if we increase funding, what happens if, right? So we talked first about institution support funding. There's a lot of research around the impact of support funding, to where we conclude that if we decrease that funding, then you'll force public institutions to respond by raising tuition and by cutting expenditures. And I think that underscores that, aligns with what Ben said earlier in the meeting. If you cut state funding support, and we saw this during the Great Recession back in 2009, 2010, 2011 timeframe, you force the institutions to take action. State appropriations are inversely related to tuition rates at the 4-year institutions in particular. Less so at the 2-year institutions, because the community colleges, they have local property tax revenue as a third form of financing. So the relationship is still there, but not as strong. The institutions, they'll typically raise tuition revenue by enrolling more non-resident students. And we've seen that in the last 10, 15 years around the country, especially for large flagship institutions. And we see oftentimes the largest cuts are often to education-related spending, right? So this can be the most prevalent, especially at 2-year and regional institutions. If you take state funding away, they are going to cut the student-facing positions, because they have no choice, because they have less fat, as some people might say. Research also shows that when you cut state appropriations, it has a negative impact on enrollment, and it negatively impacts graduation rates and completion outcomes. So our state's 40-40-20 goal is an outcome-driven goal, right? So we will retard our ability, or decrease our ability, or significantly negatively impact our ability as a state to achieve that goal if we take state funding away. And you can see that documented decreases in completion and graduation rates occur at 4-year institutions, and there's often a decrease in statewide bachelor degree attainment. What happens on the other side when you increase institution support funding? A whole bunch of good stuff happens. There's a lot of research on this. I tease out just 2 research studies. On the left-hand side, one study that was done by the Federal Reserve Bank a few years ago shows that for both sectors, the 4-year sector and 2-year sector, a whole lot of good. For every extra $1,000 per student you spend on institution support, you increase the student's odds of earning a bachelor's degree. You decrease the likelihood a student will take on debt. You decrease the level of borrowing for those students. For community colleges, it decreases the likelihood of loan defaults of all kinds of loans: car loans, house mortgages, credit card loans, the whole kit and caboodle, and it improves credit scores in the zip code of the student's residence by over $3,000. So this report, this study I find fascinating, because this is one of the first times we really saw student outcomes aligned with consumer outcomes, which is why the Federal Reserve Bank did this study, and again, shows a whole lot of good that can come from state funding. And to wit, on the right-hand side, we have a recent report that shows increase in state appropriations often yields a larger increase in the graduation rates for diverse students. So, which is important and ties within our equity lens here in Oregon, right? So we're very interested in not just completions, but closing the gap between our diverse student population or underrepresented student population and white student population. So lots of good comes from increasing state funding. When we talk student financial aid funding, what happens? Well, a whole lot of good happens as well. The effect of student aid on enrollment overall is mixed. It can cause students to attend more expensive institutions where they're eligible to receive aid. So on the enrollment side, the preponderance of evidence suggests state aid programs successfully retain students in their home state. But programs with easy application processes, simple eligibility requirements, and related marketing efforts are the most successful for inducing students to enroll. So on the financial aid side, it's a little more complicated because the increase in dollars positively affects student affordability, but the best bang for your dollar is not just by adding money, but by also adding simplified eligibility requirements, easy application processes, the support that the student, so not just the funding, but the support the student needs to obtain that funding and persist throughout their college degree program is important. We see that most research studies suggest that state funding causes students to persist and graduate at much higher rates than their non-aided peers. And this is exactly what we found with the OOG in the last annual report that Dr. Amy Cox and her folks published on the state of OOG funding. This is probably not super surprising to anyone, but receiving financial aid allows students to remain in college. And students with the most financial need are the most likely to benefit. Evidence suggests that for every $1,000 in grant aid that a student receives, degree completion increases approximately 2.5 percentage points. So a lot of good comes from this, from adding additional money to student financial aid as well. On the workforce side, the challenge with assessing the impact, especially for federal funding, and this is predominantly through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or what we locally call WIOA, the impact is limited by its relatively small scale. So you might have seen earlier in this slide deck that our the total funding for workforce within our budget is only 4 or 5%, 6%. It's 1/10 the size of the funding we provide in institution support. And that means something because when you have such a small scale, it's difficult to assess. But what we did see in last calendar year was that the limited amount of federal funding for WIOA offered our workforce friends the chance to serve 14,822 participants, which resulted in an adult employment rate of 68% and a credential attainment rate of 75%, which is higher than the national average, I believe. I'd have to double check that, but a lot of good comes out of this very limited funding. And research shows that by providing intensive services, so not just funding the participant or the learner, not just giving them money to get more training or to, achieve a credential, but with that funding, providing intensive wraparound support services in conjunction with that funding increases the employment and wage rates anywhere from 7 to 20%. So this underscores the importance of those wraparound and navigation supports to accompany the workforce training and financial aid funding as well. When we talk about workforce funding, we'd be remiss if we didn't also address the significant level of state investment over the last 7 years. Oregon, through our state legislature, through Future Ready Oregon, has infused $200 million of state and one-time federal funding into a suite of workforce development activities that is going to last, over the last 4 years. This includes formula-driven support for colleges, universities, workforce boards, competitive grants to local organizations for targeted efforts, and it includes Oregon Youth Works as well to serve younger Oregonians. And this investment is important because it reflects the increasing state leadership and coordination of local workforce development activity. And so the state funding typically offers more flexibility than federal funding, and it allows for innovative service delivery models and targeted investments, not just in priority populations, but in priority industry and sector areas by region. And so these state investments right now are focusing on manufacturing technology, healthcare, wildfire mitigation, and other areas. But the state funding component is extremely important because of that additional added flexibility. So that was a lot of information, but how do we then draw them all together? How do we align financial aid funding, workforce program funding, institution support funding? So this is complicated because if the goal is to spend the least amount to increase enrollment and promote social mobility, then financial aid is by far the most effective, right? However, institution support and workforce remain critical policy tools that also positively impact learner outcomes, including completions, attainment rates, and labor market participation, and helping ameliorate critical workforce shortages in our state. So the challenge is that because the purposes of the funding streams differ, it's difficult, almost impossible, to determine the appropriate ratio, right? So I'll stop short of saying for each additional incremental dollar, we should put 30 cents into here, 40 cents there, and the remaining 30 cents here. There's no magic ratio available to inform this, but the purposes vary, but can be used and should be used in a complementary way. So the policy recommendations offered by our friends at the State Higher Education State Higher Education Executive Officers, or SHEO, they wrote a report a few years ago. They suggest that states rarely have adequate resources to fully fund every priority, no doubt. So the decisions made to allocate these resources can propel progress or create unintended consequences. And the second part of that's really important with the unintended consequences. So they recommend, in general, if at all possible, increase state funding support, which is, of course, one of our strategic priorities. States are likely not going to see significant gains in positive outcomes without increased investment. But the funding can be adjusted to promote equity and attainment. And this is an important key because you can use the $800 million for the Community College Support Fund, the $1 billion for the Public University Support Fund, and the $400 million for student financial aid through OOG and Oregon Promise to promote equity and attainment in alignment with our equity lens by adjusting those funding allocations. And so that's why the university funding distribution model, the community college funding distribution model, both now include very strong equity-based components to do exactly that. Not to suggest that there's not room for improvement, there certainly is, but we're certainly starting down that path. And third, the third recommendation, which I think is just as important, is that learner supports and messaging matter. The most successful programs invest in supports for learners, and in addition to the aid. We see this in financial aid, we see this in workforce funding. If you provide funding for service, that's great. You should also provide funding for the learner supports that they'll need, the wraparound support services to really supercharge the outcome. And the messaging matters. And we see this a lot in the financial aid sector, where, you know, if the students don't know about a grant program or a financial aid program, if they don't know how easy it is to apply for one, then they'll never access that program. And this is a challenge in Oregon and other states, where we find in Oregon alone, I think last year there was a study that showed for Pell alone, since it's an entitlement, we had eligible students who weren't applying and receiving the Pell funding, to where I think there was about 30 to 35, maybe $40 million in federal funding left on the table, because students weren't filling out a FAFSA or an ORSA for it. So the messaging is vitally important, and is just as important as providing additional funding to indirect aid to the student or the learner. So that's kind of how we end this conversation, with just pulling it all together vis-a-vis these 3 policy recommendations. I'll stop sharing my screen and stand for any questions, and I hope this is somewhat helpful.
We have questions for Jim. Well, in the absence of questions, I'm not sure how to guide you in preparing for tomorrow's meeting. I could playfully say make it shorter, but
Mr. Chair, if I may, so we don't, it's not our intent to walk through these dynamics with the full commission. It really will be primarily at the subcommittee, where these questions of balancing or prioritizing institutional support, workforce support, student support are discussed and handled. I think our hope, guided in part by you, Chair Heyman, and your sort of requests for this subcommittee, is that over time, you know, beginning today and over time, this subcommittee would be in dialogue with each other about what the kind of optimal approach to crafting a state budget for post-secondary education and training should be. Because, you know, we can give you numbers, but fundamentally it should be guided by some sort of a philosophy and a set of values. And Jim, in his presentation today, has attempted to give you sort of a framework, a way of thinking in simplistic terms about our budget, because as you know from prior experience, it can get very complicated very quickly. So we've pulled back to this 30,000 foot level and said, well, it's basically these 3 categories. And the fundamental question for the commission is, how do you prioritize spending from amongst them? And maybe what else do you do as well in order to reflecting your budget recommendations, whether they're in the ARB or through some separate document? What do you do in order to really put this commission's stamp on the state budgeting process? So welcome your, you know, again, it can be in subsequent conversations of this committee, but the intent here is to engage you in that and you know, invite your questions, your perspective, your areas for desire for more information or uncertainty, et cetera. So that's really the hope here. We won't be addressing this in any deep, you know, big way at the meeting tomorrow.
Director Cannon, I greatly appreciate that helpful sort of redirection. Does that prompt any questions or comments for anyone? I have a couple. I think it's really helpful to understand the process, and I, you know, gotten, you know, this presentation a few times, but it's really helpful for me just to understand how sort of complex the issue of funding higher education is, and the way in which the different levers interact with each other. And Jim, I really do appreciate that. One of the things I would, I like your thing about, there's these different ways in which we can provide funding, and I like Dennis's complicated model. It actually makes sense to me. But I wonder if, perhaps reflecting, Ben, what you've already said, is that we would sort of end this with a set of questions about what our priorities are. I think we've had informal conversation where I think there's the general sense that the commission is highly interested in investing in student financial aid as a very positive lever, especially as you're working to achieve equity outcomes. How would we incorporate that into the thinking about our budget request? And so I think you've done a good job of explaining that we have these different pockets. We have the different ways of making investments, but then going into, I have my personal opinion, but that isn't the point. The commission can provide, I think, guidance on where we go with that. I think we have historically. I'm just trying to make that a more clear sort of guidance point to point. I guess I'd like that. There's another, and I can't, gosh, my memory's going. There's another slide earlier on. I don't know if I can go back to it in my head that I had questions about, but I apologize. I can't remember what it was. So
let me just leave you, perhaps, because I know we're winding down here, with sort of the question that I've been asked on behalf of the commission by governors and governor staffs and legislative budget writers in the final hours of their budget development, which is some version of, if we have only one more dollar to spend on higher education, where should we put it?
Right.
Because ultimately that's where, your budget document should be, or some document of the commission should be providing guidance at the end of the day. And hopefully that's $1 million or 10 million or $100 million. And the governor and the governor's staff says, look, we've got an opportunity here. Where do we put it? Right. And this commission was created in part to help answer that question. And I could opine on sort of the history of the commission's philosophy, the way that it's tended to answer that question in the past, and what some of the limitations or problems associated with that answer are, but also some of the rationale. But it's very much a living question. Right? It's one that we will be asked again. Where do we put the next $1 million, $10 million, $100 million? We won't be able to do it all, right? So what should be the priorities?
Thank you. I really, really do appreciate that. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Nothing is fully funded. And we won't even be able to ask for what we think we need under the current directions. So how do we strategically design our ask to at least reflect the priorities that we have within that limited fiscal context?
Mr. Chairman?
Thanks. Yes, Commissioner Devlin.
I think we should keep in mind, though, at the same time, I understand what Ben is saying, and perhaps when we come forward with this ARB under these conditions, we can point out where we would actually put additional funds if they were available. But we have to understand that the fact that we think that we are in fiscal limitations is based on the priorities that the legislature has already been put in place and the priorities that the governor has. It is not that fundamentally we are in fiscal limitations. When you look at what's going to happen with the CSL budget, the budget on healthcare is going to go up by a very significant percentage. just
Right.
because the CSL there is going to be computed quite high compared to everything else. And, you know, if that were to continue, the future of many areas of the budget that do not have that level of CSL increase are not going to see much in the future, depending upon future state revenue. But even with that, the decisions that have already been made make it difficult to make some of these decisions to fund other areas where they perhaps are inadequately funded. So the legislature may have to revisit some of the decisions they've made in other areas, which is very difficult. I can actually tell you that. And one of the reasons that higher education always seems to never be funded consistently is when you get into very difficult budget times, typically it's very hard to cut public safety beyond what you've already reduced it to. It's very hard during very difficult times to cut programs to serve those in need. It's harder to cut, even though we have done that, it's harder to cut K-12 than it is universities and colleges, community colleges. So they end up kind of in bad financial times, sort of towards not the bottom of the list, but not certainly in the top 2/3 of the list.
Yeah, very true. Thank you for that perspective. Anything else? We have come to the end of our scheduled time. Well, Jim, thank you again for that presentation, for helping us to better understand the budgeting process for this state, and all of you for your attention and time given to this. And I'll try to provide some scintillating summary of this conversation for the full commission tomorrow. And we'll all be present in one form or another to broaden sort of that conversation to the full membership of HECC. So I think we are adjourned. Thank you so much.